Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Costello. I'm Head of Customer Solutions at Kineo. Today, we are talking about one of the hottest topics in learning and development in recent years. In fact, it feels like many, many years, certainly as long as I can remember, which suggests that we still haven't got it right. Data, something I heard recently described as having immeasurable value for L&D, which surely defeats the purpose. I'm joined as ever by a panel of experts to pull this apart. First of all, David, please say a few words about yourself.
Hi, Andy, and nice to be with you again. So my name is David Wilson. I'm the founder and CEO of Fosway Group. We're an industry analyst based in Europe looking at next-gen HR talent and learning.
Thank you, David. Pete.
Hi there, my name's Pete Smith. I am technical team lead for the Kineo bespoke content team. So I head up a team of exceptionally talented developers who build, amongst other things, the Adapt Learning Framework and Adapt Authoring Tool, and of course, turn out any number of customizations on bespoke projects.
Thank you, Pete. And last but by no means least, Preston.
Hey, Preston Gales, Director of Learning Design and Product Innovation for Kineo. I work with our designers and Pete's team and basically all of Kineo to make sure we deliver and continue to innovate on our products and services. Been in learning for about 20 years. Started off as a high school teacher and fell in love with technology and got into corporate learning and just haven't looked back. So happy to be here.
Thank you both. And yes, particularly welcome to you, David. Thank you again for joining us. David, I'll start with you, if I may, off the back of your, as ever, comprehensive report that Fosway have produced on data and measurement in particular. I think we better start off with where we've been and why we've been stuck potentially for, 20 years, we think, in that completion mentality in corporate learning. Why have we been stuck there, do you think? And could you briefly sort of talk through the evolution of that compliance, that completion mentality that we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really good question, I'm sure, and potentially something we should come back to at the end of this conversation as well, because the discussion around what drives value from learning and what outcomes do we get from it and what's the point, how much we spend on it, almost every aspect around questions around whether it's around investment or strategy or outcome or the shift to digital from face-to-face, everything. All ultimately comes down to, I guess, understanding what value we really add, if I can put it that. And this is an old conversation. It existed, in the old world of classroom training and everything else. And typically the measures of success around that were around the obligatory happy sheets saying how everybody thought it was a really great lunch, really great course, and how and also activity metrics. So L&D is pretty good at generating activity metrics in terms of how many people have booked on what things and stuff, and maybe, as you said, completion metrics now, especially with things like e-learning courses and so on. We've really struggled to move beyond that. And this dates obviously, Kirkpatrick, which people refer to a lot, obviously goes right back to 59, I think, the Kirkpatrick 4 levels originally is from. So this is a super old topic around it. And I think as we transitioned into the sort of more modern world of digital learning and all the diversification, the explosion of fragmentation of what those things are, that problem in some ways has got worse and better, right? So it's got worse because there's all these different types of stuff out there now, right? Whether it's watching videos or sort of reading an online, resource or asset or doing a course or whatever it is. And it's got better in the sense that actually we're not maybe worrying about whether we were happy with the course is less of a measure of success. In the world of the web, everybody tracks everything and we generate lots and lots of tracking data around stuff, but actually maybe we're not as obsessed around absolute completion, absolute value. So these topics have existed. Ultimately, inherently behind this, it's a data problem, right? So do we actually understand that? Why are we maybe talking about it still today is because it's still super important. And we did some research in our digital learning realities research that we did for 2021. We published some stuff for that in end of last year. It's still pretty clear that there is pressure on L&D to show that it's adding value. And the pandemic drove a massive increase in consumption. We know that because if it wasn't digital, it probably didn't happen. So you know, we've seen big strikes in consumption. We've seen big ramp up in terms of utilization of platforms. We haven't necessarily seen that result in, is that really adding value? And it's a kind of classic thing, you know, if I can go back 20 years ago to when people originally started to look at e-learning, and they're going, well, we can do it online now and not do it in the classroom, and that's going to save me this amount of money. I've got an ROI of whatever. And the question I'd always ask was the same one: is, can you prove it makes any difference? Because if you can't prove any difference, I can give you an infinite ROI. Just stop doing it. Right. And ultimately, I think that's at the heart of what we're doing. That world, of course, is massively more complicated now because of all what digital now means is much more diverse and extensive. And clearly, I think it's important that this is, and it's not just about end monetary value. It ultimately is around, is this really making a contribution? Can people do better jobs because of it?
And has it always been, though, about end monetary value? Do you think, or of late, that sort of mythical fifth level of Kirkpatrick, where people were saying the business impact, ROI, is that where we've been looking perhaps too much at, and actually, therefore, it distracts from the impact of learning itself?
I think that's one of the reasons why we've kind of failed to really solve the problem, is because I think, you know, I mean, Kirkpatrick ultimately talked about different levels, you know, and looking for what's going to drive behavior and what's going to drive business outcome. And then we go, well, and is that going to drive a commercial value? And I think to some degree, we've artificially looked for the ROI number, right? When actually we've had to make up a lot of value data about what is the value of a certain behavior or certain outcome, right? So one of the reasons often those initiatives failed is people had to invent a value associated with a change that ultimately they put in front of the CFO, and they went, no, that you've just made that up and I'm not going to listen, right? So this ultimately has to be credible and we did some research. Just the day this, we published something in 2003 looking at impact of learning, looking at all these methodologies and going, at the end of the day, if the business doesn't measure it already, because businesses measure a lot of stuff to do with activity and outcomes, right? Not L&D stuff, but business activity and outcomes. If you can equate to those things and the business will put a value on it, great, right? The business is putting the value on it. If L&D tries to invent a value on it, doesn't have really much credibility. So that, I think sometimes we got into a trap around it, but ultimately I think it's also about, are we tracking the right stuff? Do we understand what it is that we're really trying to do? And the end of the day, this is not about L&D activity. It's actually about the outcomes and what happens from that. Yeah.
Preston, you look like you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I agree with everything Chris said. It's not sexy. L&D is not sexy. It doesn't get a ton of investment. We do know that, or we feel, investing in L&D it's more important than not investing, right? We get something out of it, but it's fuzzy. We don't know what. So everyone does the minimum. Because we do the minimum, you don't invest in that innovation. You don't invest in finding ROI, and it's kind of a chicken or an egg, right? If you make the investment in innovation, maybe you could prove ROI, and then maybe it would be you find out, oh, it's a revenue generating, let's invest more. But until you can do that, everyone's like, yeah, I'm just going to invest the minimum. And that's, you know, that's why we're still on completion.
Right. I will just point out it's David that we're joined with. David,
sorry.
No problem at all. Absolutely. So why are we tracked there then? Why are we sort of stuck there? Have we been relying on dated technology or just processes? Are we focusing on the wrong thing?
I think that one of the reasons that we've gone straight for completion is because it's quite easy. So as both David and Preston have said, once you start to get into ROI, you're already in the weeds. And actually, even long before you get into something as potentially complicated as ROI, it's still difficult because, as anyone who's had to come up with a set of clearly defined learning objectives will tell you, it's not an easy thing to do. And unless you can come up with a really clearly defined objective, then you haven't got a hope of measuring it. So we always, in learning tech, we look quite wistfully over at the world of marketing because it always seems better funded, much more advanced than we are. But actually, if you look at the problems they're trying to solve in terms of data and data analysis and optimization of websites, which they've been doing for decades now, it's a much more straightforward cause and effect sort of route that they're looking to pick up on and demonstrate and solve for. So if it's a commercial e-commerce website, you want to convert a visitor into a paying entity at the end of it. You want to send them through and you want them to buy as much stuff as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's quite clear. You can measure it, you can change things, you can measure the effect that change has had, and gradually optimize things. With us, we've got a disparate learner base, and in e-learning, we know very little about our learners. We find out as much as we can as we build it, but in reality, we don't know very much. They're coming from different contexts, they're coming from different amounts of knowledge, and measuring whether they've learned the things they need to learn to meet the learning objectives is actually a really complicated task. And so you've got to do an awful lot of clear definition of these things before you can start to measure it. Whereas measuring whether someone's finished has got 80% in a 10-question final assessment, that's much easier.
I'm going to pick up on something there straight away, Pete, if I may. You mentioned, you talk about learning objectives quite a bit there and defining those in the way that, you know, any good course used to be designed by to set those out. But to David's point about making it, proving the impact or proving the value that L&D has, should we not be looking at outcomes? And is that not the kind of philosophy, I suppose, the design philosophy that will ensure that impact, or is it just another?
So if I can pick up on that, we'll call everybody Chris, I think. That should be no, Andy, is I think, so one of the things I've talked about in the past, and I think Charles Jennings picked up on this actually quite a long time ago when I was talking about the conspiracy of convenience. So one of the reasons that we don't necessarily do this is because often L&D is really not comfortable being challenged about the outcomes that it gets created from it, and sometimes it creates almost avoidance strategies for it to some degree. Yeah. But so does the business, right? So often you find, and again, from work that we did a long time ago, you know, one of the things we realized when you really start to look at things like impact methodologies and how you bake those in, and Charles used to do a lot of stuff around performance consulting and looking at that stuff. And you know, one of the things is you realize is actually often the business doesn't want to be challenged too much on what the point of the learning was, partly because a lot of learning is associated with budget and activity that's already gone. So the last thing they want is anybody reminding them that they're not delivering the value outcome from it. Bear in mind, a lot of learning is not the primary thing, it's the supporting that goes along with new systems, projects, cultural change, everything else like this. You know, what's the value of you doing learning in a new point of sale system? Is, you know, your productivity on the point of sale? No. Is the point of sale system delivering more revenue to the company, right? It's the measure on the thing you're using. So I think one of the things we have to be careful is one of the reasons this doesn't happen is because actually there is a bit of a conspiracy of convenience that says, actually, when I'm talking to the business, they're quite happy to talk to me about learning objectives. They're not so happy talking to me about business objectives because that makes them uncomfortable on whether they're delivering the value their side as well. And from an L&D point of view, it's really hard for me to control those. The external factors that indicate success on those are not beyond my control. So I want to talk about learning objectives only and not about those things. And I think that changes the nature of the whole landscape under which we're trying to make this work. The key thing is come back to what I talked about before, though. We're in a world now which is much more diverse from a learning solution perspective, right? Massive fragmentation of the types of learning content, the learning strategies we can use, as opposed to the old model where it was basic, probably classroom delivery, or maybe a kind of click and turn e-learning course. What we need to understand is how we ultimately understand what's going to drive investment in that, what's going to drive success on that, what's going to drive value, both for the individual, but for the company. Ultimately, that's a data problem.
Okay, so what can we do then? Here we go. Just the answer this, and you're set for life. What can we do to deepen the value of the data that we get? What methods or technologies, even I'm nervous about asking, that can we use to get the most out of it? Pete or Preston, who wants to have a go at that?
So it's difficult. Imagine, so to take Pete's example of the website, and I love that. I love Google Analytics as where we need to get to see what people are doing. But imagine Amazon. If you went on the Amazon website to find what you wanted, but then you closed that and went to a store and bought the thing, but Amazon could never connect those two things. That's what learning does. That's what digital learning is. We have people coming and learning something, but then we don't have data on what they actually do about it. So what we need to do is somehow get the data of what they did afterwards. And with all the systems that organizations have, the data is there. It's about joining it up, you know, or getting them to do that thing in the digital environment. So we just taught you something. Now we want to see if you can do it. So more testing, more simulating, more putting them in the looking at the objectives and outcomes you want. Can you do it in this digital environment? And then it'll be about measuring. Yeah, we proved they could do it in, you know, in this environment at their computer. Now, did they do it on the job in the real life? And that's where we need to make that connection.
So that's kind of looking ahead a bit. I want to just mention an acronym that Pete will know only too well. Have we been relying on SCORM for too long then? Pete, just before we move on, it's the ever-present in our business, isn't it?
It's been an ever-present in our business for all 15 years that I've been working e-learning, and for quite some time before then. And
despite other new kids on the block, it's still paramount across.
It still is, and it's long in the tooth, and it's incredibly restrictive in terms of what data you can set and what you can retrieve. But the reason it's been around for so long is because it fills a very useful purpose. It does mean that e-learning that suppliers such as ourselves provides is interoperable, so you can build a piece of e-learning and be pretty confident that it will work in your client's learning management system irrespective of where it is. It doesn't do very much data tracking, and also the data that you can serve back up into your course is incredibly restrictive. So it really limits not just what we can do in terms of getting decent analytics in the course and finding out a bit more about our learners. It also restricts some of the other things that you can use data for. So personalization, building richer interactions, and also potentially automation as well further down the line. For all of those things, it doesn't have much use, and clients tend to be completely reliant on what their own individual platform can deliver. So yes, SCORM's held us back, but at the same time, there's also an opportunity there for us to be a bit more clever around how we do actually gather data and track and get more useful information out of a course. So Preston's already mentioned Google Analytics, which we used for a while. We have also developed our own in-house tool, which allows us to get learning analytics, which plugs some of the gaps that we found with Google Analytics. So you can get richer data if you really try.
And I'll be in trouble if I don't ask this. What's that technology called, Pete?
It's called Didact is the name of the technology, and the actual reporting that you can get out of the back end, we're calling very catchily didactics.
Gotcha, great. Well, we can draw a line under SCORM. That's great. What other data, maybe this is one back for you, David or Preston, what other data can provide value for business and for I suppose, to prove the L&D value for business beyond completion? And what other things are going to be useful for that conversation?
So one of the things I wanted to just pick up on, the reference, the analogy across to marketing is quite interesting. And I think we always think about, you know, training is the poor relation here, right? It's the one where the budget gets cut when there's a profit hole somewhere, etc. And I think what we forget is marketing used to be the same, right? In the bad old days, right, when it was all about above the line, below the line, and everything, and you say, well, I'm going to do all this investment in brand visibility or awareness, and nobody knew whether it drove any behavior. The thing that transformed the story for marketing was actually marketing automation and making it, you know, and the data around it. That really has transformed the whole thing, because people can track the minutiae across the whole of the funnel. It's an ecosystem problem as well, not a system problem. It's not just about one process, right? It's a whole set of things. But we just have, you know, from a digital marketing point of view, we have a huge now understanding of what's going on in terms of activity, a thing, and then we can then look at ultimately how that drives through pipeline towards outcome. And I think so that's an interesting analogy, both in the sense that, you know, we kind of need to do probably the same to happen ultimately with learning. We need to do a lot more than just measure You know, did I start the course? How far did I get through it? Did I pass the test? Did I complete it? But ultimately to understand a lot more of the detail around that as well, but also then understand the things that surround it. Okay, you know, as Preston said, if I can do online practice, right? If it's an IT skill, a lot of things have labs and online practice. Can I relate that back to how they performed in that practice to what they did in the, you know, and what they looked at in the course? Can I stream people out of needing to do the course at all because I know up front, you know, what they do or don't know in the first place? I think there's a huge opportunity, which is what you do with things like marketing technologies and workflows, is you kind of create these whole kind of bespoke personas and take people through things and stuff. There's a lot more complexity around it. But it's, you know, we forget the fact that ultimately, where before marketing could do that, often they were treated like the same thing, a budget to be plundered when there was a hole somewhere else. And I think the lack of learning is, you know, fundamental to our existence. It isn't separate to work, it's part of work. And if we want to be able to be more effective, if we want more engaged employees, we want more high performing companies, etc. Oh, by the way, we want to do that in a hybrid world of hybrid work. So pretty much all of that's got to be digitally enabled. We need to be able to build a much more kind of comprehensive strategy towards what we're tracking as part of that activity. The other thing we need to be able to do is to be able to understand the metrics and the data that the business really cares about. Those are that's their data, not ours, right? From an L&D point of view. If we can't bridge between those things, if we can't be able to show kind of correlation or causation type things as well, then at the end of the day, we're still just, you know, guessing in the wind as to what things really add value or not. So ultimately, it will be a more data problem, not less. It will be a much more diverse set of things around learning activities and in all its form, including, you know, the paths people take, what they don't take, how they do in things. But it'll also involve the ability to actually understand, as Preston said earlier, you know, what they then do afterwards, which is kind of outside the scope of L&D. Can I bridge the gap to that to understand what's going to drive value?
Yeah,
I completely agree. And that's kind of a future thing to solve, because until you've got the L&D data, then there's precious little point trying to get any of the external business data that you need to get a much more thorough idea of cause and effect. First step is get the learning data in the first place. And as you say, David, with the marketing, it didn't begin overnight. They weren't suddenly awash with money and able to create the most comprehensive tool sets. It's grown quite organically, and it's grown by proving the benefits of a tool in a specific set of circumstances, which has then led to more investment, more tooling, and so on. A marketer will have a suite of different systems that they use that they can draw on for any given instance and use case. And I think we will start to see that with e-learning, but I think initially we should and can just focus on the bits that are under our control. So the bits that we're able to interrogate and investigate. So from my narrow perspective, that's a piece of e-learning. We can get analytics on that. We can see how the learner's behaving in that. We could even benchmark and find out a bit more about learners' perception, and then ask them about how they're going to behave outside the course. You can benchmark knowledge, and that at least gives us a bit of a grounding in the data, so that as we can get richer data coming in from platforms, so from a learning platform to add to that soup, and as we get more data being shared from the business, so as L&D can push their data over to the business analysts, then we start to get a much clearer picture of what data is available, what's being used, and impact, the thing that we all actually want to get to.
Yeah, it'll bring up some challenges too, right? Today, when we design a course, we work with stakeholders and they say, we need to put everything in there. I don't know what everyone knows as individuals, so let's just put everything in there. So you're going to put everything in there, and then you're going to measure behavior. What are they doing in there? Are they changing from the beginning to the end? And if they're not, is it the learner or is it the course, right? So you're going to look at a lot of data and say, this is probably a bad course.
Well,
or are learners really struggling as much as they are? So you have to ask yourself those questions once you start looking at the analytics and then unpacking that. So you'll be able to both improve the experience for the learners and see where they're lacking. And is that a measure of the course, or is it a measure of the learner need?
And that's got to be where data comes in. Sorry, David, I was just going to say, we're using language, like, just a caveat here, you mentioned e-learning quite a bit, Pete, and courses, and of course David's mentioning learning activities, all of which could become part of a much broader program of experiences. And data, I suppose, is the point of that is to make it more meaningful, not just for L&D into the business, but for the learner. So we don't force and sheepdip everybody through everything.
Yeah. I think there's some interesting language that's kind of developed over the last 20 years around this as well, because you're right. I mean, originally kind of a lot of focus was just on completion and mastery, so have I passed the test or not? There was a shift in probably the 2000s when people started to focus a lot on utilization as well of the platforms, and were they, and some degree some of these can be smoke screens, right? I actually, I don't care what aggregate utilization. I care that the right people have done it at the right point in time and created the right outcome. If it hadn't turned out to only be 10 people, maybe that's the perfect answer for us, rather than lots of people wasting their time doing it because they weren't going to generate any value from it. So I think we have to be slightly careful around what we're ultimately looking for. But I was thinking about what Preston was saying around, and so a lot of this is contextual. And I remember looking at a study when I first started really looking at this stuff 25 years ago. And there was a study that was done, and I think it was might have been to do with some microsystems, and a project they ran internally to do sales training, right? And it's kind of a bit of a kind of bizarre story, but the reality was they had a large enough population that they could test drive running 2 different programs to see which was the most effective, right? And one of the challenges you'll know if you've worked with any company, that the idea that they can run control groups and separate things and have a proper sort of an analyzed study around this stuff it just doesn't happen very often. But anyway, one of the things that was really interesting around this, and I stuck with me forever, which is when they analyzed the performance impact, and it was sales training, right? So in some ways, if you can't show in performance impact from sales training, what can you show it from? But ultimately, what they said is when they analyzed that performance, and they had 2 programs, one was coaching led and one was face-to-face training. Right, and this is pre-digital, pre-learning, really. And then, but what was interesting is that when you looked at the lowest quartile performers, they had nothing made any difference. Right, when you looked at the third quartile, so the second worst group, the structured training made a big difference. When you looked at the second quartile, second best performers, coaching made a big difference. And for the top performers, they had negative ROI on both things. Right. But that's a really, really important lesson for us to learn around this. Okay, so what we expect to create as outcomes is also hugely dependent on the individuals, where they are at, what their capability, their performance is, etc. already, as well as the mechanisms and things that we use. And I think therefore, when we think about this, and I think we artificially, I talked about the use of language and people talking about utilization, right? As there was a period where that was like the be all and end all. Now, supposedly experience is the be all and end all, right? And it isn't, right? At the end of the day, we want it to be a good experience. What we care more about is that it matters. It makes a difference. So I think ultimately experience, you go, well, who in whose mind, who's the beholder of that experience? So yes, we want to improve, and we talk a lot about this, the learning experience and the learner experience. We're fixated with that conversation. It's really important, but ultimately it's not more important than does it drive success and value? And come back to the original starting question you asked me, Andy. 1 in 2 L&D leaders is being asked to prove that they're adding more value, right? That's a pretty strong. Only 6% in that research said they were under less pressure to prove more value. So that's a pretty stark thing in a world where we've just spent the last 2 years pushing everything online.
Yeah, and a world where we're hearing digital fatigue and cultural dissonance from our colleagues and our peers in the workplace and all that. We're going to see more, not less. I like the idea that data is the problem here, but also potentially the fix. I suppose that value straight away would be illustrated as less learner time, and we've talked a bit about those activities before. And I think, David, you mentioned learning in the flow of work. Sort of, it's about learning as we do somehow. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Learning in the flow of work, performance support, using data to sort of test and refine the learning content in your place of work as you do it. Where are we as an industry with that, do we think?
I think we're getting closer. We're not where we need to be yet. When I think of, so I'm gonna take your question, I'm gonna take David's comment, and what kind of my dream, and to go further with the Google analogies, Google Maps. That's what I think learning should be about. We have data on where people are because we have performance review data. We know what they do on the job. It's in the systems. We have that data to know, just like Google Maps knows where I am and knows where I want to go. We could take the data of where people are, learning-wise, performance-wise, competency-wise, and then use the data to tailor the training to give them a path to where they need to be. Ultimately, we're working online in systems. So how do we take that data and embed it in the systems that they're working in on a daily basis? How do we, and some systems are starting to do this. Oh, I see that you have this meeting coming up with so-and-so. Here's some materials you might want to review in advance. That's the type of thing we can do with data when we get the systems to start talking.
So learner preferences, integrated with your
competency. Yeah. We know that, you know, your manager did these things to get where he or she is. Here's some things that you could do to get, if that's your goal, if that's your point B, to get to your, you know, next step. What have others done that you might want to do based on where you are?
I noticed in the report, David, the Fosway report, when it was talking a bit about AI and recommendations, and that there are many organizations that aren't actually switching on the recommendation engines of AI yet because they don't trust, I'm paraphrasing here, so forgive me, but they don't trust the quality of the data that they're getting, which has nothing to do with the AI. It's what the AI then does with that data. It's the actual obtainment, if that's the word I'm looking for, of the data.
I think so. That's definitely true. It's also they don't, in some cases, trust the AI as well, right? It's not because it's a black box. It's not explainable. There's legitimate concerns around bias being embedded in machine learning algorithms, right, and so on as well. So it's a complex landscape. Obviously, we're looking at this not just from learning, but from recruiting, from talent, and the much wider context as well. So it is an issue. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a garbage in, garbage out kind of model going on here, right? So if the data, if you've got incomplete or invalid data, or in the first place, you know, then it pollutes the rest of the situation. I think there's also the potential, though, sometimes because context is a lot here, right? Context is everything in some ways. I can use some of the technology also to compensate by the lack of data, right? Because I can make inference around what may or may not be relevant based on proximity, your job role, proximity to other people, and the things that you might. And if you look at a lot of AI recommendation engines that exist around personalization of recommendations in learning systems, a lot of that's due to not your personal situations, but the people that you most closely connect with, the skills that you have, and what other people found useful for that, not necessarily what you will find useful. And I think that's the interesting challenge still in all of this, is being able to do it, to do it at an individual level in a way that really kind of drives validity. But no, I think we're in a world where, like, data is a non-negotiable thing, right? There's just going to be more of it from more sources. What we need to be able to do is join that up more intelligently, and really try and use it to drive the right kind of behaviors. And I think come back to the measures of success and what we're proving. If we're just focusing on completion, is completion really a measure of value? No, right? If we're just focusing on user satisfaction, the happy sheet equivalent, is that a measure of value? No. They're all relevant. If people aren't using it, that's relevant for us to know. If people aren't happy when they use it, or they've got a bad experience, that's useful for us to know. But these are all proxy measures to some degree around determining, does it really matter, or should I just not do it at all? As I said, I can give you an infinite ROI if you just stop doing it. If there's no value from what you're doing, then and I think people make that, individuals can make micro decisions around that. It's hard for companies to make that in an aggregated sense. And that's ultimately the struggle. How do we optimize what we invest? I go back to the point maybe Preston made right at the beginning is, why aren't I getting twice the budget I'm getting now? Ultimately, it's because I can't prove that I'm adding twice the value.
That's right.
So if data is something you get at the end of it as a result of it, and then we've got to make the best use of it, how can we impact how can we make best use of the early part of the process? So Preston, looking at you here, the designing for results methodology that we're looking at Kineo specifically, what's the value of that when we're looking at outcomes? Putting that yeah, go on.
I think Pete touched on this earlier. You don't know, and this is any measure, this is just learning, this is anything you do. You need to figure out where the end is. Where do you want to be? And design backwards from there. So think about your outcomes, think about your objectives, and then you can design backwards. And as David said, can you design efficiently to get people what they need as individuals? And can you embed it in their day-to-day on the job? That's the ultimate goal, and why you need to start with the outcomes, because otherwise you're designing experiences that are fun and engaging, but don't have ultimate value.
I think there was a point, Andy, you touched on, which I kind of didn't really answer, which is around the flow of work. And I think what's interesting here is, there's a lot of focus around embedding access to learning in a targeted, timely way into the systems of work, and in particular the workplace applications, Slack and Teams and so on, which, by the way, are pretty horrible places to be thinking you're going to learn in, right? They're very very noisy, very crowded.
We're tied to them already.
You haven't got a lot of time around it. A lot of the investment that we've had in UX goes out the window if I'm only ever looking at it through a bot interface and a natural language response, and then servicing things in, surface content into something, what my Alex P search criteria was suddenly doesn't really seem to matter that much so it's quite a complex thing. But I think at the end of the day, when you think about it, what you have an opportunity to do, and the bit that's the key here is understanding the flow of work, not just the flow of learning, right? And I think we've always had this artificial distinction between learning and work being kind of separate things. I wrote a paper and come out with a model for this, where we're talking about it in 2008, around how the integrations that surrounded learning, and that one of the most critical ones at that time, everybody knew they had to integrate with the HR system, right? And they were starting to focus on how it integrated with talent. What they missed was how it integrated with work. But that's an old problem again there. But if we don't understand the language of work and the data of work, we can't understand the language of learning and how it needs to fit into it as well. So that's, I think, an interesting kind of segue across ultimately to where that might need to go. But I just think we're also overstating that. We're at risk of being besotted by something that ultimately definitely has a role and a value, but maybe is not not the whole thing. I don't want somebody who's doing a very important role for me learning through a Slack query and what they're going to do in answering my question that's going to come next. I'd rather hope that they've got the critical knowledge, skills, and capabilities to understand how to do that anyway. But maybe there's a bit of a refresh on X or Y or Z or whatever it is. And I think it's the balance between all of these things that's ultimately important.
Yeah, I love performance support. I think it adds a ton of value. If we could measure it, we'd probably see it might be equivalent to the learning. I think of digital learning as practice. It's a place where you go to practice and get feedback and get better. Performance support is when you get stuck. Oh, wait, I forgot how to do that one piece. And if you could bring it up quickly. But I've had many conversations with people that said, is that learning when you get stuck and you need help? And does that become a crutch? And do you ultimately not learn it because that's there to support you and you keep going to it every time? And I don't know the answer, but I do know.
Is it learning?
I do know that when I get too dependent on performance support, I don't bother. And I'd say this all the time with Google Maps. I don't know how to get anywhere anymore. I haven't learned to get anywhere because I have Google Maps.
That's a great reference point, right? You know,
Yeah.
people don't know how to navigate and read maps anymore because they get directions from their phone. The other thing is people don't know how to spell very well anymore because they assume that spell check will automatically have changed it.
Well, precisely, and likewise, you could argue that the ultimate success of L&D is the removal of L&D, is in that why do we need courses if we can just go and we need to know where to go and find the information. So, you know, I remember there was a trend for a while of every organization wanting their own internal Facebook, people were saying, or Netflix is the recent one, isn't it? And actually, you know, I wanted to hang a door, so I went onto YouTube, I learned how to hang a door, and then I could hang the door. Have I learned how to hang a door? If I was to now go and try and hang a door without YouTube, could I do it? Very probably not. I'd fail abysmally. But do I need to go on those courses?
Exactly. So does it free up us to learn more strategic things?
You do if your job is a door hanger, right?
Yes,
that's the simple truth, right? If that's your profession, if that's what you do, you would hope that you have built, you know, the capabilities and experience to be able to do that consistently at a high level, you know, whatever that is. And as I see, you know, the interesting thing about the pandemic is it proved to everybody what critical talent was, right? It was the guy driving the lorry or the person behind the desk or whatever. It wasn't just the CEO or the you know, the head of design or whatever it was going to be. You know, suddenly these things, it became really stark that actually companies stopped functioning, and we're still dealing with supply chain issues and stuff, or problems with, you know, the health service, right? Because we've got a whole bunch of people self-isolating because they might have the COVID or whatever it's going to be. So I think we have to understand what actually really drives organizational capability and performance, and how individuals contribute to that. But as I said, if your profession is hanging doors, you would hope that you were more than one video ahead of me on the curve about how to do it, because I'm really bad. Okay?
That's a great point, though. You think about the London cab driver, better than Google Maps, right? Google Maps can't get around London like they can. So to your point, if you're really good at your profession, you don't need the performance support anymore. So performance support can help you to a certain point until you need to be an expert.
And that opens up a whole new world of peer coaching and human-to-human interaction as well there for development. Okay, look, we need to start wrapping this up. Aware of time. Just a few more from each of you, if I may. I'm going to move on to just the probably where we started, but data proving L&D impact, which is what it's all been about, evaluating the learning against business objectives. How best can we do that then? Starting with an outcomes-driven approach. How can we map L&D data to business outcomes? What can we do that perhaps we're not doing at the moment, and get better as an industry, not just as an organization? Any last sort of headlines and thoughts?
Prioritize doing it.
Yeah, prioritize.
You know, and focus on business. You know, that focus on business outcome. I say the business tends to measure things it matters to it, right? So. You know, you don't have to create an industry of data capture on what metrics really the business values, and if they in some of those they'll value and put a monetary value on, right? They'll know what the value of a 0.1 increase in customer sat is. They'll know what a value of a 1 day reduction in time to competency is. They'll know what the value is. So if you can align with those things, and then you don't have to prove the value, you just need to prove the outcome. Right? And then the business will put the value on it. So to some degree, I think it is around understanding that and baking that into the process, and not getting too much caught in that conspiracy of convenience that just says, it's too difficult for me to do. I'm going to focus on the learning objectives.
Yeah,
you know,
I think if you can take the behaviors that we can measure within digital learning, take those behaviors and insights, and say this is what people are doing when they're in the learning. When they're in the e-learn, and then bring that to the business, that should get you a seat at the table and say, I have the behaviors that they're doing online. How does this correlate? How does this align with what they're doing on the job? You start to build a story, and the business will tell you, they'll say, oh, wow, that's interesting. Certain percentage of our population is having a lot of trouble here. So does that translate into the business? So now you have a kind of a conversation starter with the business to say, I have my data, do you have yours? Let's compare notes and see what's happening. Whereas today, you can't say that. It's a black box.
Lovely, thank you. Pete, any last thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, it's always worth coming up with some slightly different strategies for gathering some of from those data points as well. So if you think about any e-learning course that you build, you've got an opportunity to survey your captured audience, not just on the course itself and the subject matter at hand and what they know about it. You can also have quick questions about some other areas that you might be interested in producing more content around. So again, check behaviors, check attitudes. As long as you've got a way of actually capturing that data off the back, then that will give you more useful data analytics points before you actually go ahead and start investing in new courses in those other areas.
Thank you, Pete. And also, of course, if anybody wants to have a seat at that table, at the decision table with the business, then as you say, David, ask the business, because I like that business will always measure the things that matter to it.
They always do, right? And I guess the opportunity for you guys is in some ways is how do you create an architecture that does that, right? How do you join the dots up and create you have the tools that capture the things that can ultimately provide that evidence, and you can tie those things together. That's an issue on a content level, it's an issue on a systems level, and it's ultimately an issue on a L&D versus business systems level as well. So I mean, think about, the opportunity is there for us to do a lot better job. We just need to be focusing on it and not ducking the challenge to some degree. And as I said, looking for proxy measures of value that ultimately probably the business doesn't actually care about that much. And then thinking about, to some degree, it's a systemic problem, right? That's the whole thing about data, is you can only really solve it systemically. You can't, it's hard to solve on a point basis. You have to build the architecture to do that.
Brilliantly put. Thank you, David. Where can people get hold of you, David, and find out more from the reports at Fosway?
Fosway. Yeah. So thank you for that. I mean, www.fosway.com. Latest research. Obviously, we also have our 9-grid reports talking around kind of vendor capabilities and things around and the trends in the market, plus also the realities research. So what you've been referencing is some of the digital learning realities research that we publish. It
is the view of the market. If you're involved in L&D, you cannot afford to miss that. So thank you, David, very much for joining us. Pete, Preston, thank you as ever. Anybody listening, you can reach out to us at kineo.com or info@kineo.com and find out everything we're up to on our website and our various social media channels. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your days, evenings, wherever you are. All the best.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.